So hi everyone, I think we'll kick off the webinar and start now. So thank you very much for joining. Good morning from London, good evening, good afternoon to everyone from wherever you are joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Margot Monfarid and I work for the International Coral Reef Initiative Secretariat, which is a global partnership for the preservation of coral reefs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the last for Coral webinar of 2024 in partnership with the Reef Resilience Network, CORDIO, IUCN, and the MSC Foundation, hosted under the United States of America Secretariat. The last topic for these for Coral webinar series is Coral Reef Red List of Ecosystems, a global standard for conservation and collaboration. So just before we start, I have some quick housekeeping to go through, and then we can go into the rich agenda that we have for you today. So we please ask that you remain muted throughout the call. Should you wish to speak, please click the raise the hand feature in the reaction section. We'll then be able to unmute you and allow you to take the floor. The presenters will have control of their own screens. In the case of technical issues, please notify myself or Tom Dallison, who should have a backup copy. The presentations will be delivered in English only, but we do have French and Spanish interpretation. So for those of you who are new to Zoom or webinars, you see this little symbol here, the world symbol. You can click on that in the tools bar and you should be able to switch between the channels for the best audio experience and translation. For the best quality audio, we do recommend that you use a headset and microphone if possible. And then just to let you know, the meeting will be recorded and then shared alongside the meeting's presentations on the dedicated events page. On here as well, there's a plethora of resources too. We kindly encourage the participants to have your videos on throughout the entire duration of the meeting, as this will enhance the overall meeting experience. So moving into the agenda, the webinar today will last about 90 minutes. We'll start with opening remarks from Marina and Selmi, then we'll move into the introduction to the Global Coral Biodiversity Assessment Project from Marcos, and then we'll have 4 presentations from Emily, Michelle, David and Franz. If time, we'll have a Q&A and then we'll have some summary remarks from Karen. So I'm pleased to pass the floor to Marina and Selmi, the Secretary General of the MSC Foundation as of 2020. She's responsible for the successful operational and strategic development of the MSC Foundation, as well as for its financial and administrative management in cooperation with the Executive Director. So over to you, Marina.
Thank you, Margot. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so let's go. So good morning, distinguished participants and panelists. I'm very pleased to be sharing a few opening remarks to the launch of the webinar, the last one, on Coral Reef Red List of Ecosystems, a global standard for conservation and collaboration. Today, with over 40% of coral species at risk of disappearing, collective action needs to turn the tide on this worrying trend. Understanding that coral species are so vital to marine ecosystems, providing essential habitats and shelter for 25% of all marine life, while supporting biodiversity, coastal protection, and local economies, scientific research and science-based conservation efforts are more important than ever. The MSC Foundation is proud to be partnering with the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species to make a new coral species global assessment possible. The MSC Foundation is the philanthropic arm of the MSC Group, which includes the cargo division, world leader in container shipping, and the passenger division, which MSC Cruises and Explorer Journey are the 3rd largest cruises brand around the world. The MSC Foundation and the MSC Group are led by the Aponte Vago family, who create and support the Foundation's vision for preserving the blue planet and its ocean on the long run. Our foundation supports the IUCN Red List, scientific research and marine science education more broadly. Both are rooted in this long-term vision and unique knowledge of the sea that is part of the DNA of the MSC Group. The IUCN Red List is therefore a foundational guide for our decisions about where to focus our resources on preserving the oceans. Specifically, it also gives us practical direction about our work in the Bahamas on conserving and restoring coral reef around the island at Ocean Key. For example, this IUCN Red List assessment of coral tells us that Elcon coral is one of the critically endangered species in the Caribbean, identifying as having significantly declined due to the increase of warming, water pollution, hurricanes, and the severe impact of coral disease. Reducing these threats, strengthening species resilience, and support research into how corals can adapt to warmer waters are amongst the recommendations we are following with our national partners such as University of Bahamas, BAMSI, or Perry Institute, and our international partners such as the University of Miami and NOVA as well. On Ocean Key, we are identifying and growing resilient corals in an open water nursery. Identifying coral resilience is the backbone of our efforts to restore reef that can better withstand warmer seas and other stressors. I would like to conclude highlighting that the IUCN Red List also emphasizes the importance of education, awareness raising, and ocean literacy as essential tools for conservation, and that increasing public knowledge about endangered species and ecosystem can foster a sense of responsibility and drive collective actions. The MSC Foundation is proud to be part of its social media campaign, Iconic Species, launched last month as part of the Red List 60th anniversary. A central pillar of the mentioned Super Coral program in the Bahamas for the MSC Foundation is to raise awareness of marine conservation issues with over 500,000 visitors to the island annually, alongside on-board activities with over 4 million of cruise guests, including those that visit our one of the 8 ships that have an MSC Foundation Center or MSC Foundation area. We feel that we have an important role to play with cruises passengers who are ocean lovers and who, through the power of ocean literacy, can be transformed into ocean advocates. Thank you very much for your attention and wishing you a very fruitful webinar.
Thank you so much, Marina. Super great welcoming remarks. And for those of you who don't know, the MSC Foundation actually joined ICRI as a member at our 37th general meeting last year. So thank you very much, Marina. Next, I have the pleasure to introduce you to Marcos, the Programme Manager of the Red List of Ecosystems at the Centre for Science and Knowledge of the IUCN. He joined the global programme of IUCN in 2020 to support the Red List of Ecosystem programme, fascinated by the interface between science and practice. So it's my pleasure to pass the floor to you, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Margot. Thank you very much, Marine, also for the introduction and for the support that the MSC Foundation is providing to this project. I'm just gonna provide a very quick 5-minute introduction without the slides and then pass over to the speakers. But I wanted to provide a little bit of context about this project and how in the context of the coral reef, we thought it was very important to work together in the revision of the Red List of Threatened Species that was very recently launched in the COP29, showing that 44% of the coral species are threatened at some level, with a process of assessing how is the risk of ecosystem collapse itself happening worldwide. And that's the objective of this webinar, digging specifically on the Red List of Ecosystem component, how we propose to do it, and what's the next steps and the experiences we've learned so far. By doing it together within the same project as part of the Red List of Threatened Species and using both Red Lists together to inform action later, that's what was in the back of our mind in designing the project itself. The project itself started a bit inspired by the work done in the Western Indian Ocean led by CORDIO, when they assessed the Red List of Ecosystems a few years back on the Western Indian Ocean. And we will hear in the presentation Michelle Gutka presenting on that concrete experience and what they learned from the process and how they approach it. But since that has happened in the last years, the Red List of Ecosystem has been adopted as a headline indicator in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. And that has implications, especially for countries that will have to report back to the targets according to the monitoring framework. And that has implications at which level will countries want to put the effort and the focus, especially at national level. And Emily Nicholson, the co-lead of the Commission of Ecosystem Management Group on the Red List of Ecosystem, will talk a little bit about that, about the implications of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework for the Red List of Ecosystems. But the story of this project and this, it's not only about the technical issues and how do we deal with that and how do we deal with solving the problem, but it's about collaboration and how do we build synergies around working together in the same topic. And I think this webinar is a bit an example of this, where we have the Commission on Ecosystem Management and ICRI holding the microphone, the MSC Foundation, CORDIO East Africa, and well, Arizona State University is not here. It's very, very early for them. It's the middle of the night, in fact, for them, but they were the ones responsible of leading and coordinating the Red List of Species. And all of those, the Commission, Ecosystem Management, CORDIO, Arizona State University, they're all parts of the Red List of Ecosystem partnership, working together in the same direction. And I think that exemplifies a little bit what we try to do in this collaboration. Furthermore, the idea of the project is that the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network of the ICRI could be the platform to expand this process elsewhere in other hubs. And David Obura will explore in the webinar how, which role the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network would play and how the project has been designed trying to build on that existing network. And we'll finalize the webinar with Francino Smith talking more about the concrete application, how we've developed some tools to help the concrete application of the criteria in the case of using the data for coral reefs in the GCRMN network. So I hope you enjoyed the webinar. It's been really a pleasure, all this process, and I'm looking forward to work with several of you. Thank you very much, ICRI, for holding the microphones. Over to you, Margot.
Thank you so much, Marcos, for providing us with the context and story of this project. I know we've only had 2 introductory remarks, but I've heard collective action, working together, collaboration and synergies, and I think that's exactly what the coral reef community do. So thank you very much for that. Next, we're going to hear from Emily Nicholson, the co-lead of the IUCN RLE thematic group in the Commission on Ecosystem Management and professor at the University of Melbourne. Her work has impacts on conservation policy and practice at global and local levels. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you. And I'll just, I'm hoping that you can see my slides. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk in a very general way about, as an introduction to the Red List of Ecosystems, not on a coral reef specific example. I'll have a sprinkle of corals in there, but I think that you all know much more about them than I do. So I'll keep this more at the general and particularly the global level. And so I'm just going to give you a quick introduction, not get too technical, but hopefully give enough detail that to give context to subsequent slides, particularly from Michelle. So the Red List of Ecosystems is a framework, a standard, and a set of criteria for assessing the risk of ecosystem collapse. It was adopted as IUCN's global standard in 2014 to complement the species level information and Red List of Threatened Species, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. I sometimes joke that the Red List of Ecosystems is like the grandchild of the Red List of Threatened Species. The Red List of Threatened Species just turned 60. The Red List of Ecosystems just turned 10. In particular, what it really, one of the ways that it complements species assessments is by looking at the change in the distribution of ecosystems and the way they function. And this means we can look at interactions amongst species, but also look at changes in common species rather than necessarily only the threatened species. The red list of ecosystems is applicable to all ecosystem types, so terrestrial, marine, freshwater, and those that sit between. And you can read more about it on the red list of ecosystems website. Some of the key concepts that underpin the red list of ecosystems include defining what an ecosystem is and also what ecosystem collapse is. So an ecosystem is defined by its species or the biota, the environment, and the processes and interactions between them, and they're in a place. They're typically defined by the assessors, but in a red list of ecosystem context, depending on the purpose and also at the scale. You can obviously define them more broadly or narrowly, depending on what you're assessing. Ecosystem collapse is a core concept. So a red list of ecosystems assessment aims to assess the risk of collapse. And this can happen globally, the whole ecosystem everywhere can collapse, or local, just parts of its distribution. So what is it? It's where an ecosystem loses these defining features, the species, the structure, the processes, and the interactions. And a new ecosystem will emerge with new defining features. It may be replaced by another ecosystem nearby. Or it may be a novel ecosystem. And these can be valuable. It's not always straightforward. It can be quite uncertain. So for example, in this case study, in the photos here, a native grassland, when it's replaced by suburbia or a car park, it's pretty obvious that it's gone. But when it's been replaced by introduced pasture and used for grazing, it can be more uncertain. And here we need to use ecological theory and data and expert judgment. And one of the examples of an ecosystem that's collapsed is the Aral Sea, which underwent a massive transformation due to water extraction. And I'm sure for all of you who work on coral reefs, I don't think you need to think too hard about areas of coral reefs that have collapsed already locally and how you would define that. Okay, so one of the key steps in doing an ecosystem risk assessment when you're describing the ecosystem and how it functions is to develop a conceptual model of an ecosystem. And this really helps you to share your understanding of it, clarify your assumptions, and communicate with others in the assessment process. It also helps you identify some of the key indicators of change. And so this is a conceptual model from the Mesoamerican Coral Reef Assessment, which was published in 2017, which is one of the early Red List of Ecosystems assessments that predated the Western Indian Ocean assessment. And it really shows how, obviously, corals are really key. Coral cover and corals are a key part of central to a coral reef ecosystem, but some of the other key features that you may want to measure, things like its fish, but also you can understand how threats like climate change can affect the system. So how do you go about doing an assessment? The first stage is knowledge synthesis, where you're pulling together all the information that you have about that ecosystem, maps of that ecosystem, typically current and also past, potentially also future. A description, you're bringing together all the information to write a description of that ecosystem. So you would be including the species that are characteristic of that ecosystem and the function, the processes. You would develop a conceptual model and then compile measures of change in area and integrity of that ecosystem. Then you use this data as the basis of assessing against a set of criteria, which are the symptoms of risk. And these, for the red list of ecosystems, include the change in distribution, a restricted distribution. So if an ecosystem is small, it's intrinsically at risk of a major threatening process. And then down here at the bottom, where we're looking at change in integrity. So for example, the change in the abiotic environment or the changes in the biotic or the living parts of the ecosystem and the interactions and the composition of that ecosystem. And we measure this over different time frames, looking into the recent past, into the future, and into the long past, the historic past from industrialization, typically. On the basis of this assessment, you can allocate an ecosystem to different risk categories. And these are very familiar because they're very similar to the risk categories used in the Red List of Threatened Species, where we have the threatened classes are critically endangered, and vulnerable. And from this, you can map your threatened ecosystem. So here we have one of the outcomes from the South African Red List of Threatened Species assessment, where you combine the risk outcome with the maps of the ecosystems to map the threatened ecosystems. So the critically endangered ecosystems are in red, endangered in orange, and vulnerable in yellow. And you can see in South Africa, they've done a wall-to-wall assessment of all their marine, terrestrial, and freshwater ecosystems, which is quite extraordinary. So just to give an idea of what I mean, sorry, when I go back, this assessment against the criteria to allocate into a risk category, here's an example from criterion A for Colombia. And these are 5 real ecosystem types. And we have the change in their area, in their distribution over the last 50 years. And so for the top ecosystem, very little of its distribution has been lost, and it remains least concern. But this purple one here has lost over 80% of its distribution, and therefore it's critically endangered. And these risk categories are evenly spread to make them informative for decision making. Similarly, when we look at the loss of integrity or degradation of an ecosystem, this is criteria C and D. It's a little bit more complex, but the same principles apply. So here we have 2 dimensions, which is the severity of the degradation, and also the extent, so how much of the ecosystem is degraded. And you can think of a few different pathways here. For example, you can have an ecosystem where part of the distribution is highly degraded, which is the case here. Or you may have another ecosystem type where most of the distribution is moderately degraded. So there's different ways that an ecosystem can become threatened, and this is reflected in these different pathways, these different combinations of the severity of the degradation and the extent of it. And this is measured, this indicator for degradation is always measured. It's an ecosystem specific indicator, and it's measured relative to a collapse threshold for that indicator. And Michelle will talk about that in the context of the coral reefs in the Western Indian Ocean. But it's really important to note that these are ecosystem specific indicators. They're not generic indicators that are applicable to all ecosystems. So how do we then use that information? Well, we assess all these as many of the different criteria as possible. And then the basis of the Red List of Ecosystems Risk Assessment Protocol is that the criterion under which the ecosystem is at greatest risk represents the weakest link for that ecosystem, and therefore the risk category, the overall risk category for that ecosystem. So here again, I come back to the Mesoamerican reef assessment. We find that the ecosystem hasn't really changed in its distribution. As you would well know, with many coral reefs, they don't necessarily lose area, but rather they become degraded. And this was the case for this assessment, where based on the last 50 years of degradation, the ecosystem is endangered. But when we look to the future, the next 50 years, then it's critically endangered due to the increased risk of coral bleaching. And so because critically endangered or red is the highest risk category, the whole ecosystem is critically endangered. So just to give a sense of where we have Red List of Ecosystems assessments, about a third of the countries in the world could report on their, or have assessments available to them for all terrestrial ecosystems, a bit less for marine ecosystems than terrestrial, and freshwater again. And then about another 30 countries have some ecosystems assessed, for example, all forests or all coral reefs. So we can see that there are still areas here in white where we need increased investment in Red List assessments and ecosystem mapping as well. And particularly in the marine realm, we haven't not as many ecosystems assessed as we'd like. So I'm just going to very quickly pass on to the next part of my presentation, which is about the role of the Red List of Ecosystems in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So the GBF, as we call it, because it's such a mouthful, is the latest of a set of goals, iterative goals that have been set under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the primary multilateral agreement for nature with over 190 countries who are parties to this convention. You may have heard of, for example, the ICRI targets, which was the previous set of targets and goals, which largely were not met. So the GBF has 4 outcome-oriented goals, which relate to safeguarding nature or biodiversity, maintaining nature's contributions to people, sharing the benefits from nature, and goal D is about mobilising the resources to implement the GBF. In order to meet these goals, there are 23 action targets, which in principle should enable us to meet the goals of, for example, safeguarding biodiversity. And these include, for example, the 30 by 30 target, which is for 30% of the world to be under protection in protected areas by 2030, and other targets that relate to restoration. And there's also a monitoring framework to track progress, which includes headline indicators, of which the Red List of Ecosystems is one, as Marcos mentioned. So I think one of the interesting things about the GBF is that the whole framework took a very strong ecosystem approach across the goals and targets. In particular, the first clause of goal A relates to ecosystems and their integrity, connectivity, and resilience. While there's also multiple targets that address ecosystems, and in particular, target 1 on planning to stem loss of ecosystems, target 2 on restoration of ecosystems, and target 3 on protection of biodiversity. And across the 26 indicators, we have at least 5 headline indicators that relate directly to ecosystems and which make a set that can help us understand the plight of ecosystems globally if they're reported consistently across the indicators and across countries. And the way that we've recommended this be done is by using the global ecosystem typology to report on the Red List of Ecosystems, for example, or the extent of natural ecosystems. So what does this look like in practice? So here's a version of the figure that I showed before about, we've got our Red List of Ecosystems assessment, we have our risk assessment outcomes, and then from this we can derive an index, the Red List index, which is comparable to the species Red List index, which countries can report by ecosystem group using the global ecosystem typology. And then from national data, we can also calculate a global index. And so here's an example again from South Africa, where they've done repeat Red List of Ecosystems assessments. And what I've shown here is the change in Red Lists, the average Red List status by ecosystem group. And what we can see here is in black is all the ecosystems, but we've seen some groups of ecosystems that have seen really big declines. And that means they're much more threatened, but from 2018 to 2022. And one of these is the coastal shrubs and grasslands, for example, this Alexander Bay coastal Junifeld, which is now highly threatened. We can calculate a preliminary Red List index of ecosystems globally from the Red List of Ecosystems data I showed before. And just returning back to this global ecosystem typology and why how this can be used. So one of the key benefits of using this is it supports consistent global reporting between countries and across indicators. So it doesn't replace national data on ecosystems, but rather it helps to place it in context. So if you can imagine here's in red your national data, and that can feed up and be aligned with this global synthesis hierarchical classification system that was developed by the Red List of Ecosystems team. This has become a much adopted tool. It's been adopted by international bodies, including the International Statistics Commission has recommended that it is included in the International Statistical Family of Statistical Classifications, and it's also used by IUCN and in ecosystem accounting. So it allows us to harmonise existing national data by cross-referencing, so aligning your own ecosystems into one of these categories, and I'll explain those in a moment, but also it can support the development of new ecosystem classifications. So the typology has a website. I really encourage you to go and explore it. There's 110 ecosystem functional groups, and each of them have these indicative maps and photos and text to describe them, which is really helpful when you're stuck in your office and you want to see a bit of the world. And just to give an example of what I mean by these ecosystem functional groups, here's one example of the tropical and subtropical, the Pyrrhic tussock savannas, which are found globally in different parts of the world, in Brazil, Mozambique, and Australia. They are made up of different species, but they all function similarly and they look similarly, and they're really driven by these dynamics of fast-growing grass and fire. Just to give a sense of where coral reefs fit in here, they're part of the photic coral reef ecosystem functional group that sits within the marine shelf biome, along many other familiar ecosystem groups such as seagrass meadows. And to give to show how these how we can use this ecosystem information to support global reporting on ecosystem change. This is an example again from Colombia, where we can look at the headline indicator A1, Red List of Ecosystems, which tells us about how threatened our ecosystems are. Extent of natural ecosystems tells us about what we've got left of our ecosystems. 3.1 tells us how protected they are. And what we can see is these really clear patterns where the tropical dry forests are all critically endangered. And this is because they have lost so much of their extent, they've almost gone, and they're also very unprotected. There's only about, of the 5% left, there's only about 3% in protection. And this contrasts with the tropical lowland forests, which we rightly worry about, but whose plight is not quite so dire, thankfully, and is almost at the 30% target for protection. And the very last point that I want to make is really about how important the Red List of Ecosystems is, not just for monitoring progress in the global biodiversity framework and indeed in local conservation action. And I think Michelle's going to talk a bit more about this in the context of the Western Indian Ocean and coral reefs in Kenya. But the sort of information that we compile when we're doing a Red List of Ecosystems assessment, so information on ecosystem integrity, ecosystem maps and description, and then how threatened they are, is all really critical data for implementing the targets to help us meet the goals of the GBF. And in particular, you think about setting priorities for restoration or protection, maps of ecosystems and understanding of how threatened ecosystems are and which ecosystems are threatened and why is going to be critical for understanding where we should restore ecosystems, where we should protect ecosystems, and also to guide threat mitigation, for example, for sustainable use or pollution and the impacts of climate change. And I think I'll leave it there. And happy to take any questions if we have time, or can come back to questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think we'll do questions all together at the end. So if people do have anything that they want to pop in the chat, then please do. Great to hear more about the RLE and delving deeper into the steps you would take for that assessment, as well as the role of the RLE and the GBF, which is super important. So thank you very much, Emily. Our next speaker is Michel Goedke, a coral reef ecologist who is currently pursuing his doctorate at the University of Melbourne and senior scientist at CORDIO East Africa. So I'm pleased to pass the floor over to Michel.
Thanks, Margaret. Let me just share. Let me know if that's okay.
Yes, working well.
Okay. So yeah, thanks everyone for attending this presentation. I'll be talking a bit about how we applied the Red List of Ecosystems to coral reefs of the Western Indian Ocean. So the Western Indian Ocean is a area which covers East Africa, East and Southern Africa. So that's countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and South Africa, as well as some island states just off the East African coast, such as Madagascar, Mauritius, Seychelles, and Comoros. So the whole process, I think, began back in 2019. It was supported by Norwegian Agency for Development, NORAD, and really started with this workshop that we held in Kenya, where we invited a number of experts, coral reef experts and researchers and managers, MPA managers, to learn a bit more about the Red List of Ecosystems, what it's about, how to implement it, what data would be required. So we had experts like David Keith, Marcos was also there. And so we spent a whole week discussing that and how we could apply it to our context in the Western Indian Ocean. And there was just general agreement that it would be something useful for us to undertake. And really through that process, we discussed kind of what data we have available. And luckily, a couple of years earlier, we had undertaken a global coral reef monitoring network, so GCRMN, coral reef status report for the region. And so through that process, we had compiled data from across the region. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that data was. But that really was the foundation that enabled us to undertake this Red List of Ecosystems assessment. And I think I'll touch on it during this talk, but I think David will talk a bit more about it in the next talk as well. So really the GCRMN was quite pivotal in undertaking this assessment. And you can see at the bottom of the slide is the list of all the different data contributors that provided data for this assessment. So just touching on what Emily was talking about in terms of how you need to think about this concept of ecosystem collapse and apply it for every ecosystem specifically. So if we think about coral reefs in this graphic here, on the right in green, you can see maybe a healthy coral reef that might be considered least concerned when you think about it under these RLE or Red List of Ecosystems risk categories. So a reef with high levels of coral cover, low levels of competitors like macroalgae, and quite large populations of fish, and particularly important fish groups. And you see that as a gradient as the health of the reef slowly declines as you move to the left of this diagram towards a reef that you might be considered as collapsed. So a reef where there's really no living hard coral, it's dominated by rubble and algae, and really all the fish have been depleted and fished out of the system. So one of the first steps you need to do when you undertake a Red List of Ecosystem assessment is assess or try and understand what geographic scale you want to undertake the assessment at. So we used some existing assessments which looked at the marine ecoregions of the world, which divided the Western Indian Ocean into these different ecoregions based on the biogeography of the system. Then Varen had done in the corals of the world, had assessed the Western Indian Ocean based on coral species distributions, and David had also done something similar, but using more specific local data for the region. So we used all these three to think through what would make sense from an ecological and biogeographic perspective for the region. And we divided the Western Indian Ocean up into these 11 ecoregions shown in this map. And that fits in this global typology that Emily was just talking about. That fits in at this level 4. So this is defining these biogeographic ecotypes or ecoregions. So that was the level we assessed. We assessed the Western Indian Ocean as a whole, and then we assessed these 11 ecoregions individually as well. Second step really was developing this ecosystem model. So thinking through all the characteristic native biota. So what are really the most important biological components of the ecosystem? and what are the important processes that impact the ecosystem. So those could be things like threats, and what are the interactions between all of these. So we developed this conceptual model of the functioning of the ecosystem with corals or hard corals, fleshy algae, and fish at the center of this as that really important biological components. And then thinking through some of the key threats that affect reefs in the Western Indian Ocean, things like fishing, warming, coastal development, sedimentation. So those were really the foundational building blocks through which we looked at our ecosystem. And we tried to understand, well, okay, given this is what's important about the functioning of the ecosystem, what do we have data for, and what can we quantify and assess inside this RLE, Red List of Ecosystem framework? So just to touch on it again, so the RLE assessment, when you try and implement it, you're looking at 5 different criteria to assess an ecosystem. 2 of them are area-based. So criterion A and B are area-based, and then criteria C and D look at the integrity of the ecosystem. We were not able to assess criterion E, which is a quantitative model. So when you try and assess, you assess each ecosystem, you're thinking through kind of what is the ecosystem model, what aspect of the model are we looking at, what data do we have, and then the RLE has a set of rules and thresholds that you then apply, and that will tell you what threat status or what risk status and category your ecosystem is under each one of these criteria. And then you get this, this risk status here, which Emily already presented to you. So your ecosystem could come under criterion A, could come out as being vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, near threatened, or least concerned. So I'll go through each one of those criteria individually to show you, discuss how we applied it for coral reefs. So here's the example of the RLC. So criterion A, again, is about this reduction in geographic distribution. So the reduction in the area of your ecosystem over a 50-year period. So it's really easy to visualize this with the RLC. You can see in between a 50-year period, the water body declined quite dramatically. So for coral reefs, we have a few limitations. We don't really have maps that in a lot of areas that extend over 50 years, which is a key kind of requirement for the Red List of Ecosystems. Coral reefs, just by their nature, can transform, they can degrade into a different and switch to a different ecosystem, even though the geomorphological structure of the reef is intact, especially if you're mapping it from satellite. So you'll still see the reef, but that reef might be highly degraded. So it's not really the best way. You can't really detect changes in area that way. So what we decided to do instead was to use in situ data of hard coral cover and see what proportion of sites that we had hard coral data had fallen below this threshold. And we used a threshold of 10% hard coral cover as our threshold. So we thought we'll try to understand how many sites had fallen behind that. So for example, with the Red List of Ecosystems, if you lose 30% of your ecosystem area over 50 years, you would be considered to be a vulnerable ecosystem. So we did that for each one of the ecoregions and assessed them accordingly. Criterion B looks at the distribution of the ecosystem. So this is slightly different to the area. So you're thinking about how well distributed your ecosystem is. And the logic behind this is if an ecosystem is very close together, a single threat like a cyclone or a warming event could impact the whole ecosystem and potentially drive it to collapse. So in this case, you would want an ecosystem which is more widely distributed would be considered to be something that's lower risk status. So you look at this through 2 metrics, the extent of occurrence and the area of occupancy. So this map here shows the extent of occurrence. So you draw this polygon around the entire extent of your ecosystem, and you look at the area of that polygon. And the RLE then has these rules. So for example, if the extent, the area of that polygon is less than or equal to 2,000 kilometers squared, your ecosystem is considered critically endangered, as long as there is some ongoing threatening process within that, affecting that ecosystem. So we did this for every ecoregion to understand how well the ecosystem is distributed within the ecoregion. So for this, we used a satellite-derived layer of the extent of coral reef, so the Millennium Coral Reef layer, which is a global layer. But we also incorporated some local data. So, for example, South Africa had mapped their coral reefs locally, so we adjusted the Millennium Coral Reef layer to incorporate that local data. Criterion C looks at the environmental or abiotic degradation of your ecosystem. So what's the environment around your ecosystem? Is that changing? For coral reefs, we wanted to think about things like pollution or nutrient pollution and the water quality impacts of that, sedimentation. But we didn't have the right data to do that across the entire region. What we did look at in the end is the thermal stress or the warming that's impacting coral reefs. Obviously, we all know that this is probably the greatest threat to coral reefs already today, and will continue to be the major threat moving forward as things warm up. So we looked at thermal stress and coral bleaching, but we looked at it over the next 50 years. So what is the condition of reefs today, and the condition of the environment and the temperature profile of reefs today versus what it will be like in 50 years. We used projections of degree heating weeks, which were developed by Van Hooijdonk et al. And so that looks at, they have this projection data of degree heating weeks every year for the next 50 years. Actually, for the next, up until the end of the century. The indicator that we use, so remember Emily talked about how for every ecosystem you have to develop indicators that are specific for the ecosystem. So in this case, we looked at the number of years where degree heating weeks exceeded 12. So 12, I think this is changing now with more severe thermal warming events, but really 12 is considered a threshold where you are most likely going to get very severe bleaching that will lead to significant coral loss and death if you have a degree heating weeks of 12. So we looked at that. And we developed this threshold or collapse threshold that we said that if you get these events where you have degree heating weeks of 12 twice in a decade, it will be very difficult for your coral reef to recover and withstand that level of thermal stress so frequently. So using that data, we were able to assess each reef and to see how they would fare in the future. Criterion D looks at the biological degradation, the biotic degradation of your ecosystem. So it's different to criterion C, which looks at the environment. So we assessed 4 ecosystems that we felt were four indicators that we felt were very important for the ecosystem health of coral reefs in the region. So that was, we looked at hard corals, macroalgae, herbivory, and piscivory. So hard corals were measured through hard coral cover, which is a very common metric, and there's a lot of data available there. Macroalgae, we looked at what the ratio of macroalgae cover is to coral cover to try and understand the interaction between those two groups and their competitive nature. We looked at parrotfish abundance for herbivory, and we looked at group abundance for that really top-level fish trophic control. So all this data is available through long-term monitoring that's been undertaken in the region. There was varying levels of monitoring across the region. Some countries had more extensive data than others. And we assessed all these indicators by looking at how they had changed over a 50-year period. So just to go into a bit more detail about that, so within the RLE, they have something called the relative severity of decline. So that's really looking at where you are today for each one of those indicators. So what's your hard coral cover today compared to what it was 50 years ago? So that's your initial condition. And relative to what it would be if your reef is collapsed. So for hard coral covers, for example, we set our collapse threshold at 5%. So we said if your reef has 5% coral cover or less, you are collapsed. And we had an initial condition of where our coral cover was before 1998, which is when the first big bleaching event happened. And we wanted to assess where we are today relative to these 2 points. So there's more information, more detail, and how you go from this, calculating this to getting your threat status. But I think it's too much detail to go in this one presentation, but that's all been documented in the paper that was published. So you can read through that for more detail. But really what we wanted to think through then was we have all these 4 different indicators under criterion D. And each indicator will produce a risk status from least concerned to collapse. So how do we get a single risk status across the entire ecosystem, considering all these 4 indicators? And all these four indicators, then what we did was consider them in the order of their interaction. So hard corals interact with fleshy algae, parrotfish graze on fleshy algae and exert some top-down control, and groupers exert some top-down control on parrotfish. So what we decided to do was develop a structured sequential model where we start with the status of hard corals and increase the status by 1 if the next component is at a greater risk. So I'll explain that in a bit more detail. But really what this tries to do is address the role of corals as architects. So really giving the most important to hard corals because they are really the keystone ecosystem engineering taxonomy. And reducing the effects of some of the other higher order components like the fish. So, so an example here, if we take northern Tanzania and Kenya, we have a risk status for corals, which is least concerned, algae is near threatened, parrotfish is near threatened, and groupers is endangered to critically endangered, so that top row. So we start with corals, and so the overall ecosystem risk status is least concerned under corals. And then we take that up to algae, and algae were near threatened. So that's a level of risk above least concern. So we push the whole ecosystem's risk status up by 1. So we're up at near threatened now. We take that to parrotfish. Parrotfish were also near threatened. So the ecosystem threat risk status and parrotfish risk status is the same. So there is no change to the overall ecosystem risk status. And then we take that near threatened to groupers. So endangered and critically endangered is higher risk status than near threatened. So we increase the overall ecosystem risk status by 1 to provide an output of vulnerable. So our overall ecosystem risk status under criterion D came out to be vulnerable. If we use the other approach from the red list of ecosystems, is just to take the highest risk status across your indicators, you would have your criterion D risk status as being endangered to critically endangered because of groupers. But we wanted to avoid that because we felt that that would be overinflating the risk just based on groupers. Another example here very quickly is West Madagascar. So it's following the same principles, starting with corals there, near threatened, thinking about algae. Algae is vulnerable, so it's a level above near threatened. So we move the overall status up by 1 to vulnerable. And then going through that same process, you can see parrotfish is vulnerable, so there's no change there. Groupers are also vulnerable, so there's no change there. So again, the overall risk status for West Madagascar under criterion D was vulnerable. So just talking very briefly about the overall region results. So the Western Indian Ocean as a whole, coral reefs were considered to be vulnerable to collapse. So they fell within the risk status, so quite a strong result there. And then when you think through the 11 ecoregions that we assessed individually, all of them, so maybe not a surprising result, but still quite a stark result, was all of them fell within the threatened risk categories. 4 of them in yellow here were found to be vulnerable. 3 in orange were found to be endangered, and 4 in red were found to be critically endangered. So the endangered and critically endangered ecoregions were mainly because of criterion C. So the future warming projections are very dire and considered to be a high risk that will cause mass coral bleaching quite regularly. So that's why they were very threatened, whereas the vulnerable ecoregions were primarily vulnerable because of the biotic degradation over the criterion D. So the level of degradation over the last 50 years was found to be quite high, mainly because of overfishing and the impacts that has had on groupers in particular. So then going into more detail, these assessments could also provide, so if we think about Comoros as an ecoregion, you're getting all this different information about your ecoregion. So you've assessed 4 different criteria, A, B, C, and D. So the green colors indicates that they were least concerned under the 2 spatial criteria. Under criterion C, the environmental degradation, it was red, so critically endangered. And under criterion D, the biotic disruption, it was yellow, so considered to be vulnerable. And then you can see there's all the sub-indicator information under criterion D. So there's a lot of information you can gather about your reefs through one assessment, because you're looking at all these different aspects. So in a single standardized framework. So it's all looking at different aspects, but looking at them in a way that's comparable and standardized. So that's kind of the work we did. I haven't included it here because of time, but we did take it one step further recently, and we have a paper that's just been published in Conservation Science and Practice, which looked at criterion D in even more detail and went down to the reef site level to produce results at the reef site level. So you have information through the RLE where you have data from the reef site level up to the national level, eco-regional level, and the entire region. So really informative stuff that can be used for management and policy at various different levels. So I'd just like to thank you all for your attention. This paper was published in Nature Sustainability, I think a couple of years ago. So if you have time, please give it a read. There'll be much more information there on the methods, especially in the supplementary materials. There's all the details of how we undertook this. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was super interesting and great to learn more about the case study, as well as some of the challenges and the data needed for that assessment in the context of coral reefs. I think it's no surprise the dire state of coral reefs that you've just showed from that assessment, but it's super important that we do have these to help inform conservation efforts and influence policy decisions moving forward for coral reefs. So super interesting. Thank you very much. Next, I'm pleased to introduce you to David Abora, who chairs the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, so IPBES, and is founding director of CORDIO East Africa. After 30 years of research on coral reef vulnerability to climate change and their importance to society, his focus is now on linking local to global challenges to help society pivot towards a safe and just future. So I'm pleased to pass over to David for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Margot, and greetings to everybody online. It's a pleasure to be here with the team and presenting on the RLE for coral reefs to you all. So what I'll do is I'll give this presentation together with Karen Moyes from our CORDIO office, who's coordinating this effort with the joint project with IUCN and the MSC Foundation and Arizona State University, in which we're trying to take, so having heard about the RLE from Emily and then how we applied it in the West Indian Ocean from Michelle, our focus now is in extending it to coral reefs around the world and using the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network as a foundation, the data foundation for doing that. We'll check once. And I'll start off. So this is already in motion. So I'll describe a little bit of how we upscale and move from what we've done to reach out to many of you online. Hopefully you're here because you're interested in applying this from one of the GCRMN regions. the project we have is facilitating that process. I've adapted my slides a little bit just to respond to where we are now in the discussion in the previous presentations. So applying the RLE to coral reefs globally. Now, it's been clear to me all along. I've been working with the GCRMN. CORDIO has been coordinating for the Western Indian Ocean since the early 2000s. And I've played a role in our region and also in the global network, really agitating. We're trying to get it so that we really understand our data stream from the GCRMN. It's not just a reporting process on the status of coral reefs for GCRMN or under ICRI, but we can really be the data pipeline for reporting on global frameworks, national indicators. Here for the global biodiversity framework, as explained by Emily, the RLE is now a headline indicator, number one, on that framework. And so within the GCRMN, we really have not only the ability, but I also take the responsibility to provide this data pipeline because of the dire status of coral reefs now. They're declining so fast, and in just a few decades that we need to streamline how we can get our data from local up to global level. So this issue of scale is very important. In thinking about the RLE for coral reefs, it doesn't make sense to have a global sort of threat level for coral reefs. Are they vulnerable? Are they endangered? It's really hard to really understand what that means, given we also have different, we have two main reef biomes in the Caribbean or the Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. But the regional scale here shown by the GCRMN sort of regions is a manageable one. A lot of us work at eco-regional or national or subnational scales, and how do we go from these smaller scales up to the global? Within the GCRMN, all the monitoring programs basically measure coral cover. We're also able to report fleshy algae cover globally. Most of our programs also collect fish data, and Michelle has explained how we use that in the RLE, but we're not able to aggregate the fish data at a global level yet, still within the GCRMN, but we are able to do it regionally. And so this regional framing, I think, is critically important. And the GCRMN regions provide a suitable scale at which to try and address this globally. Now, the RLE has been applied in, there have been 4 separate studies applying the red list of ecosystems to coral reefs. You've heard a lot about the one that we have done, which we published in 2022 in the Western Indian Ocean. The first assessment was in the Caribbean, sort of the first paper really presenting the RLE to the world, showing how it can be applied to multiple ecosystems. So this assessed the Caribbean as a whole, as endangered to critically endangered, EN through CR. There's an application in the Mesoamerican barrier reef, which Emily presented in her presentation as an example, and this assessed the Mesoamerican reef as critically endangered in 2017. And then there's been a study in the Colombian Caribbean looking at the national scale in the context of the Caribbean coasts of Colombia, rated those reefs to be vulnerable, and then 2 subregions. So the methodologies are all quite compatible. The RLE is very well designed for being able to follow different pathways into a common result. But of course, given the commonality of the data that we have in the GCRMN, we expressly developed our West Indian Ocean analysis to be applicable to other regions across the GCRMN regions. I'll just use this slide to illustrate this issue of scaling. And this is one of the sort of earlier development slides we used in developing the 2020-2021 GCRMN Global Report, which shows the 10 GCRMN regions, which provide a practical level at which we interact with one another as coral reef monitoring programs in these various regional networks. They function quite well. They're all quite independent from each other, but come together under the GCRMN. Now, at a smaller scale for the global report in 2020, we identified these subregions, between 3 to 7 subregions per region, depending on the size of that region and the amount of data present at each of those levels, going down to smaller scales. And as Michelle has explained, when we did the West Indian Ocean RLE, we actually went from I think it's 5 subregions we used in the GCRMN reporting, to 11, which we could justify on the basis of the biogeography of the coral reefs of our region, but also the amount of data that we have, because the smaller the scale you go to, the less data you may have to apply to the analysis. And also the more vulnerable reefs get by their nature, ecosystems get more and more vulnerable, or they're more they are more exposed to single large scale events, the smaller and smaller that ecosystem gets. So if you define your ecosystem at a very small scale, you can very quickly push the assessment up to critically endangered. But this provides a template on which other GCRMN regions can work from to consider what would be an appropriate scale to do this analysis. So I think what I'll do now, the last slide is coming to the map that we're using. It's a bit more visual than the last one, and I'll hand over to Karen Moyes and our team to go through now describing where we are now in terms of reaching out with different GCRMN regions in terms of taking forward this project and some of the analysis that we can do. So over to you, Karen. I think if Karen is online.
Thanks,
hopefully.
David. I
Yes.
hope you can hear me all right. My
Yes.
internet hasn't been great. But yeah, hi everyone. So as David mentioned, I'm Karen Moyes from CORDIO, and I'm helping to coordinate this initiative together with the IUCN and with funding from the MSC Foundation. So we've made some significant progress since introducing this initiative at the ICRI General Meeting in Hawaii last year. And we've been working with Francine Smith, who has developed a code repository based on the Western Indian Ocean RLE assessment, as well as a wiki guidebook and standardized templates to facilitate regional RLE assessments, which he will talk about shortly. So we've been engaging with the ICRI secretariats, the GCRMN core committee, and the GCRMN regional coordinators to align this work with other ongoing activities. So since the completion of the Western Indian Ocean RLE assessment, the Eastern Tropical Pacific and ROPMI regions have come on board to start their regional coral reef RLE assessments and are ready to use the tools that we've developed. We've also had several meetings with South Asia, and we're looking forward to discussing the initiative with the new Director General of SASA. The Pacific region is currently quite busy with the upcoming global status report, but once the bulk of the work is done, they are planning to apply the framework at the national level next year in a couple of countries first. We've also been engaging with the Caribbean, where the UNEP Cartagena Convention Secretariat in Sporak, they'll have a meeting on the 9th to plan their next steps as well. We'll also be having a meeting with the Brazil Regional Coordinator later today on their own regional assessment. And lastly, we recently presented at the East Asian Seas Regional Workshop, who are currently planning to apply the framework at the national level for Singapore. So as you can see, we've been working with the GCRMN and the regional coordinators to start this, and we have been working hard to get as many systems in place to help that process as well. So after this, Francine will talk a little bit about some of the tools and support that we have to then support regions in this process. I think a key part of what we want to do is really have a bottom-up approach, so have each region carry out their own regional assessment as you have the knowledge and data for your regions, and that can then build up to give a global perspective. Thanks, Margot.
Thanks. Perhaps I can just, if I can come back in at the end of what Karen just said to make a couple of points. So as Karen just said, I mean, the key thing that we're trying to set up is that, well, so one is that when we're doing the GCRMN compilations for the global report, it's the perfect time to do this work because all the regions are already doing all the work they need to update the coral and the fleshy algae in their data sets as is. So it's a perfect point to do this. It takes a bit more work to compile the fish as well, but I think there are generally people interested in each region to do that, and we do have some resources to help with that as well. The other point is that this is really to help the regions do your own analyses. This is not to build up a centralized sort of global RLE database, but to help each region make the most use of its coral reef data that it can to inform management and governance, and also of course, the global processes as well. So this is really an ideal point in which to implement this while getting all the data together for the global report, and perhaps once that main work is done, then to do some additional work with us that we can facilitate as well to compile the regional RLEs. So thanks very much.
Thank you, David and Karen. It's super interesting to see the process you're taking to apply the RLE to coral reefs globally. And then for those of you on the call who might not know what GCRMN, it's the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network, which is an operational network of ICRI, and it was founded back in 1995. So as David and Karen just expressed, the GCRMN are collating data for the next Status of Coral Reefs of the World report, and I think Tom's popped some further information on that into the chat. So super interesting to learn more about what's going on a global scale, having heard about the RLE assessment from that case study in the Western Indian Ocean. So thank you very much. Our last speaker is Franzino Smith, so I'm very happy to introduce you to Franz, a data scientist focused on applied analytics for natural resource management, biodiversity and climate change in New Zealand and developing countries in Latin America. So over to you, Franz.
Yes, thank you very much. Margot, how are we doing for time? I'm just looking at my watch, and I thought it would be good to be able to leave enough time for a question and discussion for the group.
We have, so the webinar is supposed to finish in about 15 minutes. So we may have time for questions. If not, if people have any pressing questions, please do just start popping them in the chat, and then we can always come back to people afterwards.
Yeah, or what I can do is, because I think a lot of what I was going to discuss has really been covered by Michelle and Karen and David. So I think I could just show a few slides and then leave it open for questions and discussion. Does that sound okay?
Perfect.
So as mentioned, I've been helping develop the technical tools to assist in the application of the Red List Ecosystem Assessment for coral reefs. And I'm just going to skip to our approach to regional collaboration and capacity building. So this is particularly for guiding the analysis based on the code that Michelle presented in their study of the Western Indian Ocean. As Karen mentioned, we're leveraging the existing nodes of the GCRMN to do this analysis, and we've developed a strategy for engagement and training to assist in this analysis. And we've done that based on some training we've done in the Eastern Tropical Pacific nodes. So this is specific to coral reefs, and also in the Western Indian Ocean. So that's really sort of informed our approach to this. So our engagement strategy is really broken down into some modules of 1-hour training sessions for each region. And that basically illustrates the use of the repository and some examples, any sort of data pre-processing that needs to be done in order to use the code that we've set up, and also some guidance on applying the standards. So things like the area of assessment and things like that. We think we should be able to provide some preliminary results for the key criteria, like in this first phase of engagement, and with the idea that regions will be able to go back and finalize things. We also, in this process, would like to be able to support the formation of regional repositories. These are basically copies of the Western Indian Ocean analysis. And that's the idea of that is to facilitate collaboration and also some upskilling in terms of how to use the version control system and things that we utilize. And this will also allow regions to have some flexibility in the different amounts of data pre-processing they may require. And in this process, we also, as sort of a project team, would like to engage in like a broader synthesis and knowledge management of the process. And this basically would mean documenting the analysis steps for each region and identify any gaps in terms of capacity or data, those sorts of things. And this is really aimed at strengthening the regional collaboration and the knowledge management in terms of doing these global assessments. And the next steps, just to wind up, as Karen mentioned, we would like to build on the engagement that's already been initiated by CORDIO and IUCN to present the overall approach and the framework, to foster the coordination and communication. And then we would like to start planning for these regional engagements. So these are yet to be determined, but the idea is that we would be scheduling those with, for those who are interested, with the node coordinators, identify the team that will be doing the analysis from each node, and doing a bit of a capability assessment to see what additional support they may or may not need. And we would like to do that basically from now to the end of March to do this first initial assessment. And then we would go away and do the synthesis of the information. We're planning to use a workshop that's planned in Bangkok towards the end of February to just sort of bring a lot of this together. And obviously documenting the regional processes in terms of this, the steps and the decisions of the analysis from each region and their methodologies. And then help create a task list for final analyses, and also identify any additional support that nodes may need. And then, for us, basically constructing a report of the lessons learned in the regional synthesis that obviously we would share with everyone, because the idea is to basically capture this knowledge on how you conduct this type of analysis. And that's basically all I have to present.
Thank you so much, Franz. Again, super important to acknowledge the work that's been done for capacity building, so to strengthen the skills, knowledge and resources across the regions globally. So great work that's being done across the regions globally for RLE. We have about 5 minutes for some questions if anyone has anything that they would like to ask. It's great that we've got lots of people here today joining us, and then we'll move into some concluding remarks and summary from Karen. So if anyone does have any questions, please just pop your hand up and we'll pass the floor to you. I don't see any hands being raised. I'll give you another 20 to 30 seconds if there is anything that people would like to ask. This is a great opportunity, so go ahead.
Hello, sorry, I couldn't find the hand raising icon.
Go ahead, please go ahead, Aileen.
Okay, so I have a question regarding the red list of ecosystems. So you use macroalgae cover as an indicator of degradation, as far as I have understood. So I work a lot in Tanzania, mainly in Zanzibar. And what I have seen on many reefs is that it's not just macroalgae that can take over. It can also be corallimorpharians, for example, which are also competing with hard coral for space. I wonder if such unfavorable benthic organisms also should be considered in the assessment and evaluation, or is there a reason for it why it's not? I guess it depends on the region because it's, yeah, very variable, but yeah. That's my question.
Perhaps. Thanks, Elma, for that question. Perhaps I can come in on that, Margot. So that you're absolutely right. It can be other things that come in and take over from corals, not just macroalgae. We also include turf algae in the fleshy algae definition. But the challenge is at the regional levels, we don't get consistent enough information on those other taxa to be able to analyze those. So the smaller the scale you do the analysis, the smaller the ecosystem unit that you identify, the more able you may be to bring in additional variables that have very localized data and sort of contextual information too. So it depends on the scale and the model that we're able to apply. But thanks, that is the right kind of question.
Thank you for that. I think we have another question in the chat from Mathilde, who's asking, are there standardized data collection protocols and databases available for the assessments? I let any of the experts go ahead.
Michelle, do you want to take that?
Sure. So thanks for the question. So there are standardized protocols published by the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. So the GCRMN have a few manuals on how to conduct coral reef monitoring and the different types of data collection you can do. They're probably available to download on one of the websites, and then different regions have their region-specific manuals as well. So for the Western Indian Ocean, we have a few manuals as well. I think David has authored a few. In terms of databases, well, again, the GCRMN is collating all this data for the global assessment, and then regions have their own databases that they've compiled. I don't know if at the moment, nothing is really open access on any open platforms, so you can download the data, but I think that's hopefully a step in the future that different regions might be able to get to.
Yes, if I could just mention that we are building a routine for processing data that's collected using Mermaid. So Mermaid is like a standardized platform for managing monitoring data for coral reefs. So we're building some tools that will allow you to, if you're using Mermaid or would like to use Mermaid, we can basically use the exports from that to feed into the analysis. So that would just allow you to use that. And if you have other collaborators in your region that are using that platform, then that would greatly assist in doing the red list for ecosystems analysis.
Thank you so much for the answers to that question. I see that Tom Dallison, my colleague from ICRI, has his hand up, so over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Margaret. I just wanted to come in with respect to data and the GCRMN. As we've heard, the global assessment is underway, and the question of available data always comes up. And whilst each data holder or data contributor has different criteria around using their data, it's sort of a conversation that we're having in the GCRMN in terms of how do we promote sort of better data sharing. But just with respect to the global assessment, I've just posted a link to the GCRMN's GitHub on one of the pages that hosts the synthetic data set for the global assessment. And 2 points on there, you will see a list of the data sets that have been contributed. Some are marked as open access, where we've had permission from the data contributor to grant access to those data. But these are by request only, where you can access the website and make a request for those data. So there are data available on the GitHub that have different criteria around accessing those. So I do encourage you to explore those. And building on Franz's point as well, we're working closely with Mermaid and other platforms such as Reef Cloud and CoralNet as well to ensure sort of that integration of data into sort of these global assessments. And finally, when the next global report is released, the model data will be made available through the report, which will hopefully set a baseline building on the 2020 global report. So just wanted to make that you aware of that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom, and thank you very much for the questions. If you do have any more questions, please do just pop them in the chat, or feel free to reach out to us individually or to ICRI, and we can share those questions directly with the speakers from today. So we only have a few minutes left, so I would like to pass over to Karen Wehers, who is going to share with us some summary remarks for the webinar. She's a senior scientist and manager at CORDIO. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Margot. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today and for your engagement in this critical conversation about coral reef conservation. We're deeply grateful to the MSC Foundation for funding this project and enabling us to expand the red list of ecosystems globally. Special thanks to IUCN for their coordination efforts and Arizona State University for their invaluable contributions to this initiative. I'd also like to express our appreciation to ICRI and the Reef Resilience Network for hosting today's webinar as part of the For Coral series, and to the GCRMN leadership and regional coordinators for their tireless efforts in advancing coral reef conservation across the globe. Finally, a heartfelt thank you to the regions and their teams who are actively participating in this process. Your dedication and collaboration are what makes this work possible. We look forward to continuing this important journey together, strengthening partnerships and driving meaningful action for our reef ecosystems. Thank you, and please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any further questions.
Thank you so much, Karen. And then just before we do fully finish, all of this information will be shared via email after the webinar, and it will also include a link for the recording. So the presentations and additional resources will be found on that dedicated ICRI events page. The next For Coral webinar will take place in 2025, so that was our last one for 2024 and super interesting. We're pleased to have everyone join us today. If there are any topics that you'd be interested in seeing within the series, then please do just reach out and we'd be happy to work with you on that. Just for your interest, we made note that there is a webinar tomorrow and the 5th of December on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. Your questions answered, and that will be run by Resit. I'm not going to try and pronounce the surname and embarrass myself. So Resit, the chair of the IUCN SSC Standards and Petitions Committee, and they will discuss some of the common misunderstandings when applying the Red List criteria and how to improve the chance of your assessment being published smoothly on the IUCN Red List. So just if that's of interest for people. And then again, as Karen's already mentioned, a huge thank you to all of our speakers for the incredible presentations, and to our partners of the webinar, the Reef Resilience Network, CORDIO, IUCN and the MSC Foundation, hosted under the ICRI chairmanship of the USA, as well as our financial supporters, the Principality of Monaco and the Government of Sweden. We'd also like to take the time to thank our incredible interpretation team who have done an excellent job. So thank you very much for that. And then lastly, a huge thank you to everyone who took the time to join this webinar today. And we really look forward to welcoming you back to the For Coral webinar series in 2025. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you again to the speakers, and thank you for joining.